The morning sun was still climbing over the jagged ridges that framed Fort Redstone, but the air already carried the weight of heat. Dust swirled lazily across the open training field, clinging to boots, uniforms, and the thin layer of sweat. That came with early drills. A line of recruits stood in loose formation, catching their breath after a brutal set of sprints. From somewhere down the row, a voice sliced through the haze, mocking and deliberate. "Nice artwork on your face, Sergeant." The man drawled, his smirk audible in the tone alone. "What did you do? Lose a fight with a meat grinder?" A few chuckles rippled through the group, cautious but not too cautious. The speaker, Corporal Mason Riker, thrived on that kind of reaction. Broad-shouldered, sharp-tongued, the kind of soldier who could run a mile while still tossing insults like grenades. He stepped back into formation slowly, making sure everyone caught the grin stretching across his face. The target of his jab didn't answer. Sergeant Harper Lane stood alone, tank top darkened with sweat, a strand of dark hair plastered to her forehead. Her arms were corded with muscle, but they carried a lattice of pale scars that traced down to her hands. Across her left cheek ran a jagged line, old, pale in the center, but with angry red edges that suggested it had been reopened. Not long ago. A faint, puckered mark curved from her jaw toward her ear, disappearing into her hairline. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Behind her, the line shifted restlessly. Some looked at her openly, others out of the corners of their eyes. She was new. To Bravo Company, the only female soldier assigned to this unit in over a year, and she had arrived without ceremony 3 days ago. No introduction beyond her name and rank. No backstory offered. No explanation. Just a transfer order signed at the very top dot. The rumors started before she'd even unpacked her gear. Some said she'd been in a training accident and was being benched here to recover. Others insisted she'd been demoted from a cushy intel position after screwing up a high-priority mission. A few suggested the scars were from some ugly street fight in whatever civilian life she'd come from before the military got. The truth was no one knew. And in the absence of facts, people got bold. "How many drills does it take to fall flat on your face, Sarge?" Riker kept going, his voice lazy but calculated. "Or do you just practice running into doorframes for fun?" The laughter this time was sharper, more confident. But Harper Lane stood as if she hadn't heard a word. What irritated Riker most, though he'd never admit it, was that her silence wasn't flustered or embarrassed. It was deliberate. She didn't look away, didn't adjust her stance. Her posture was straight, her boots planted, her hands resting loosely behind her back. She gave him nothing. From a small rise at the far end of the training field, Colonel Elias Ward stood with his hands clasped behind him, his gaze fixed on the scene. Tall, lean, with iron-gray hair and a stare that could pin a man to the ground without a word. Ward had been at Redstone longer than most soldiers had been in uniform. He didn't move to intervene. Not yet. He knew exactly who Harper Lane was, and he knew what would happen once the others found out. The sun climbed higher, heat pressing down, and a bead of sweat slid along the edge of Harper's jaw, catching the light as it traced the ridge of her scar. Private Alvarez, barely out of high school, shifted uncomfortably in the line. He'd laughed along with the others, because that's what you did, but something about the way the sergeant stood there, unmoved, made him uneasy. Riker, sensing the hesitation in the group, pushed again. "What's the matter, Sergeant? Got nothing to say? Or are you just afraid your face might fall apart if you move it too much?" Even those who'd been smirking started glancing toward their eyes, checking if a superior would step in. Ward didn't move. Harper's eyes flicked, just once, to meet Riker's. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't even cold. It was steady, unshakable. The kind of look you give when you've seen worse things than the man in front of you could ever imagine. Riker felt the faintest twinge of discomfort and covered it with a scoff. Then, without warning, Ward's voice rolled across the field, calm, low, carrying enough weight to still the air. Call sign Iron Viper. Everything stopped. The laughter cut off mid-breath. The shuffling of boots halted. Even the wind seemed to fade. Riker frowned. Iron what? Ward descended from the rise with slow, measured steps, each one landing like the strike of a gavel. His arms were no longer behind him. They hung at his sides, fists loose but ready. You just ran your mouth at Iron Viper. Corporal, Ward said, his voice as sharp as the desert air. A ripple of unease moved through the formation. Private Alvarez's eyes widened. Somewhere down the line, Sergeant Blake, a veteran of 2 deployments, straightened almost instinctively. The name was familiar. Too familiar. They'd heard it whispered in barracks during late-night watches. Passed between soldiers like campfire ghost stories. Iron Viper wasn't just a soldier. She was a warning. A legend spoken about in the same tone as failed missions and classified reports. The stories varied. A covert extraction in the Black Ravine, a standoff in the ruins of Brackett City, but all ended the same way, with Iron Viper walking out alive when no one else should have. Riker's smirk faltered, but he tried to recover. That's just a nickname, right? Some kind of Ward cut him off, not with volume, but with precision. 4 years ago, a 6-person recon team was deployed into the Cormac Pass, hostile territory. Winter, no air support. Their mission was to intercept a weapons convoy before it crossed the border. He let the silence stretch. They were ambushed on day 1. The recruits listened despite themselves. 2 dead before nightfall. Another gravely injured. 1 captured. That left 2, both wounded. 1 with a shattered leg, the other with shrapnel buried deep in her ribs. Ward's eyes fixed on Harper. She hadn't moved. No reinforcements. Ward continued. No rescue. Just snow, cliffs, and enemy patrols closing in from every direction. They should have died out there. All of them. But one of them didn't. She carried the comms officer on her back for 10 miles. Dragged the man with the shattered leg on a rope rigged from a snapped rifle and a torn harness. She climbed the last cliff with her hands bleeding and frostbitten. Because stopping wasn't an option. Ward stepped closer to the line, his shadow cutting across Riker's boots. And when they made it back to the rendezvous point, she refused evacuation until both men were on the chopper. That's who you just mocked, Corporal. The silence was heavy now, not empty. Riker didn't meet Harper's eyes. For the first time since she'd arrived, the formation stood straighter, not because protocol demanded it, but because something in the air told them they should. Ward's voice dropped, quieter, but it carried farther than a shout. She didn't earn those scars in a bar fight. She didn't get them from tripping on her own 2 feet. She got them because she walked through hell with 2 men who would have been corpses without her. He turned his gaze across the unit. And she came back here to teach you how not to die. No one moved. Harper Lane's expression hadn't changed. But in the eyes that now lingered on her, there was something new. Not pity, not even guilt, recognition. The recruits still stood in frozen formation, as Ward's words hung over them like a lingering echo of gunfire. The name Iron Viper seemed to hum in the air, charged with stories half-remembered and rumors half-believed. No one spoke. No one dared. Colonel Ward's gaze swept the field one last time before he shifted, his tone turning deliberate, slower. Most of you think the worst day you'll ever have in uniform is running drills in the heat or pulling night watch in the rain. You think the world outside this base plays by the same rules you do. It doesn't. He looked toward Harper, but she didn't meet his eyes. Her focus was fixed somewhere far away, a place none of them could see. Cormac Pass, Ward continued. Isn't even on most maps. It's a frozen choke point between two mountain ranges, buried under ice for half the year, guarded by men who don't ask questions before they shoot. We had intel that a convoy was carrying a prototype missile guidance system through there. If it made it across the border, it would vanish into a black site we'd never reach again. The recruits shifted, but not from boredom. They sent 6 in. Lane was one of them. Harper's breathing had changed, not heavier, not quicker, but altered. The memory was there, waiting. Snow. Everywhere it clung to her lashes, stung her eyes, burned her lungs with every breath. The wind screamed through the jagged peaks, whipping powder into the air until the world was nothing but white. And shadow. The sound of boots crunching on crusted ice was swallowed by the roar. They'd been moving for 18 hours straight, every step a gamble on brittle ground. Captain Monroe led the file, his silhouette barely visible in the storm. Harper was second in line, her rifle clutched tight against her chest, the strap digging into her collarbone. Behind her came Corporal Hawley, then Sergeant Darius Shaw, their comms officer, then Specialist Mendez, and finally Private Rourke, the youngest. 6 of them, cut off from everything familiar. The ambush hit them without warning. A crack of gunfire ripped through the wind, the first bullet slamming into Monroe's chest before the echo even registered. He dropped, snow blooming red beneath him. Hawley swung his rifle up, shouting something Harper couldn't hear over the sudden chaos. Then his head snapped back, and he fell into the drift like a dropped puppet. Contact, right? Mendez roared, firing into the blur of shadows along the ridge. The storm turned into a frenzy of muzzle flashes. Harper dropped to one knee, returning fire, the kick of each shot steadying her pulse. Rourke scrambled for cover, yelling into the comms, but the headset spat static. Shaw was down, clutching his side, blood already seeping through his gloves. Fall back, Harper shouted, grabbing Rourke by the strap of his pack and shoving him toward a narrow gully. They moved in bursts, firing, running, sliding down ice-slick rock until the ridge shielded them from sight. By the time they stopped, the snow was churned into a chaos of footprints and blood. Monroe and Hawley were gone. Shaw's wound was bad. Mendez tore open a med kit, pressing bandages into the hole, but Harper could see the truth in Shaw's pale, tight face. Rourke's voice cracked as he whispered into the useless comms. They're jamming us. Then we keep moving, Harper sighed, scanning the ridgeline. We get to the extraction point on foot. Mendez looked at her like she'd lost her mind. That's 12 miles in a blizzard, through patrol zones. With him, he nodded to Shaw, and no backup. Harper met his gaze evenly. Then we move faster. Hours blurred into a crawl. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was an enemy with teeth. Shaw drifted in and out of consciousness, his breaths shallow. They rigged a sled from Mendez's broken rifle and a section of rope, lashing Shaw's body to it. Harper took the lead, dragging him over uneven ground, every muscle in her back screaming. Rourke stumbled beside her, carrying the extra ammo. Mendez ranged ahead, scouting for movement. Night fell like a curtain. The wind didn't stop. Somewhere around mile 6, Mendez went ahead to check a narrow pass and didn't come back. They found the trail of his boots in the snow, ending in a spray of red. No body, no sound. Harper didn't speak. She adjusted the rope over her shoulder and kept moving. By mile 8, Rourke's leg was torn open by shrapnel from a grenade lobbed out of the dark. He went down screaming, the blood soaking through his snow pants almost instantly. Harper dragged Shaw to cover behind a ridge and knelt over Rourke. The wound was ugly. The cold slowed the bleeding, but it would also take his toes, maybe his whole leg. She had 2 choices: Leave one of them and move faster with the other. Or take them both and almost certainly die out there. She didn't hesitate. Shaw stayed lashed to the sled. Rourke she hoisted across her back, the weight crushing down on her lungs with every step. They didn't speak for the last miles. Couldn't. Storm stole every word. Somewhere in that white void, Harper stopped feeling her fingers. The rope burned grooves into her shoulders, the weight of Rourke pressing her spine into a knot of agony. Every step was an argument with her own body. At some point, she started crawling, her legs no longer capable of standing, dragging the sled inch by inch. When the faint thump of helicopter blades finally reached her ears, she almost didn't believe it. She stumbled into the clearing, collapsing to her knees, the sled still clutched in her raw hands. She didn't remember shouting into the wind, but suddenly there were arms lifting Rourke off her back, medics swarming Shaw. Only when both men were strapped into the chopper did she let go of the rope. She didn't get in. Not until she was sure. The others were secured. The sound of the storm faded. The training field came back into focus. Ward was still speaking, his voice as level as it had been when he started. That's why they call her Iron Viper, not because she's fearless, because she doesn't stop once she bites down on the mission. Not for pain, not for weather, not for death breathing down her neck. Riker's face had drained of color. The recruits looked at Harper differently now. The scars on her arms weren't just marks. They were a map of somewhere none of them had ever been. She still hadn't spoken, and maybe that was why the silence around her felt heavier than any speech. The air in the mess hall felt heavier than usual that afternoon. Conversations that once bounced easily between tables now seemed to falter whenever Harper Lane walked past. It had been only 2 days since the briefing where Colonel Ward revealed her identity and the truth about her scars. In those 45 minutes, the arrogant laughter, the whispered mockery, and the dismissive glances had evaporated, replaced with a stiff, almost awkward silence. Mason Riker hadn't spoken to her since, not a single word. And yet Harper could feel his eyes on her, not with ridicule anymore, but with something that felt uncomfortably close to guilt. She kept her tray balanced carefully in one hand, her other still aching from an old injury that hadn't quite healed. Right. She set it down at the far end of the table, away from the others. It wasn't because she wanted to be alone. It was because she didn't want anyone to feel obligated to sit near her out of pity. She had lived through enough pity to last a lifetime. From across the room, Ward entered, his presence immediately commanding attention. He didn't need to shout. The natural authority in his step spoke louder than any voice could. He scanned the room, his gaze landing briefly on Harper before continuing. She noticed a small nod acknowledgement without drawing attention. That was his way. Mason stood slowly from his table. His movements were deliberate, almost hesitant. He crossed the room and stopped in front of Harper's seat. For a long moment, neither spoke. The mess hall seemed to hold its breath. "Is this seat taken?" he asked finally. Harper looked at him. There was no malice in his voice this time, no sarcasm, just a quiet, uncertain tone. "No," she replied simply. He sat down, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't know," he began, his words slow, like each one was weighed before leaving his mouth. "What you went through, who you were." You didn't need to know," Harper interrupted. "And it wouldn't have mattered. You'd have still made the joke." Mason flinched, the truth landing heavier than he'd expected. "Maybe," he admitted, "but it would have been wrong either way." They ate in silence for a while. Harper didn't look up, her fork moving methodically through the mashed potatoes. Mason kept glancing at her hands, scarred, strong, but trembling ever so slightly when she lifted her drink. "I meant what I said at training," he finally added. "About you being tough. I just didn't realize how much that meant." Harper gave him a faint, humorless smile. Tough isn't about surviving bullets or blasts, Riker. It's about waking up every day when you don't want to. About carrying pieces of yourself that you can't get back and still doing the job. Mason swallowed hard. Is that what happened? You lost someone? Her eyes met his, and for the first time since they'd met, Mason saw past the walls. She kept up. Yeah, she said quietly. I lost a lot of someones. Before he could respond, Ward's voice echoed across the hall. Lane, Riker, with me. They both stood, setting their trays aside. The colonel led them out into the hallway, his steps purposeful. We've got a situation, Ward said without preamble. Training exercise just changed. You're both on point. Mason frowned. Sir, not a request, Ward cut in. You'll be briefing in 5. Full kit. Harper didn't ask questions. She had learned long ago that if Ward was this direct, something real was happening. Mason, on the other hand, seemed caught between confusion and apprehension. 5 minutes later, they were geared up, the midday sun beating down on their helmets as they approached the armored transport. The vehicle's engine growled impatiently, ready to move. Inside, the briefing was quick. A simulated hostage rescue, but with live variables, real volunteers playing the civilians, unpredictable timing, and randomized enemy placements. It was designed to push them to their limits. Harper could tell, though, from the way Ward's eyes lingered on her, that this was more than just an exercise. This was a test. The transport jolted into motion, dust kicking up in a trail behind them. Mason checked his rifle, his movements sharp but clearly fueled by nerves. You've done this 1,000,000 times, Harper said. Not unkindly. Not with you watching, he muttered. She smirked slightly. You'll be fine. Just don't freeze. He almost laughed, but the tension kept it caught in his throat. They hit the drop zone fast. The air outside was hot and dry, the kind that clung to your lungs. Harper took point, her boots, moving with deliberate precision, scanning angles before signaling Mason forward. The first building was clear. The second wasn't. Gunfire cracked from the upper window blanks, but loud enough to spike adrenaline. Mason ducked behind cover, returning fire. Harper moved without hesitation, sliding into position to flank. She took the assailant down with 2 controlled shots, signaling the room clear. You move like you've done this in your sleep, Mason breathed. I have, she replied, stepping over the threshold. More times than I care to count. They cleared the remaining buildings, securing the hostages and exfiltrating within the time limit. By the time they returned to base, Mason was sweating more from the pressure than the heat. Ward was waiting at the gates. Not bad, he said, his tone neutral, but not perfect. Lane, Riker debrief in 20. As they walked toward the barracks, Mason glanced sideways at Harper. You ever think about quitting? After everything? Harper paused mid-step. Every day, she admitted. But quitting doesn't make the ghosts go away. It just gives them more room to follow you. Mason didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded, understanding more in that moment than he ever had before. That night, Harper sat alone on her bunk, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. She pulled a folded photograph from her pocket for soldiers' smiling arms. Around each other, dust and sweat on their faces. She traced her fingers over each one, her throat tight. 3 of them were gone. She was the 4th. Outside, the base was quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural in a place built on noise and orders. She slipped the photo back into her pocket and lay down, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come easily not. When the past was louder than the present. Resumo in Portuguese. Na Part 3. Após a revelar cá sobre Harper. O clima no quartel muda. Mason tenta se aproximar dela, pedindo desculpas de forma indireita. Ward convoca os dois, para uma missão de treinamento intenso, que funciona como teste. Harper mostra sua habilidade de experiência, enquanto Mason comica entender o peso que ela carrega. À noite, Harper encara memórias dolorosas de colegas perdidas. The days that followed the grueling training exercise marked a subtle but undeniable shift within the walls of Fort Redstone. Harper Lang no longer walked as the silent stranger bearing the weight of scars and rumors. Instead, she moved among the recruits with a quiet authority that earned grudging nods and tentative respect. The echoes of mockery and whispered jokes faded, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of the battles she'd survived and the strength she carried forward. Mason. Riker was among the first to bridge the gap. The change wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was a slow unraveling of defenses and preconceptions. He found himself watching Harper with new eyes, no longer seeing a target for his sarcasm, but a hardened soldier forged in fire. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and gold, the recruits gathered in the mess hall again. The buzz of tired voices filled the room, but Harper sat alone, a tray of untouched food before her. Mason noticed the way her fingers clenched the edge of the table, a faint tremor beneath her calm exterior. He approached cautiously, pulling out a chair without a word. "Mind if I sit?" he asked softly. Harper's eyes flickered upward. A moment of hesitation before she nodded. "I'm sorry," Mason began, voice low and earnest. "For everything. For the jokes. For not understanding. You didn't deserve any of it." Harper said nothing at first. Her gaze drifted to the scar, tracing her forearm, the pale ridges that told stories she couldn't and wouldn't share easily. Then, slowly, she spoke, voice steady despite the weight it carried. "I didn't ask to come back," she said. "Not after what happened. But someone had to. Someone had to make sure the next group didn't make the same mistakes." Mason leaned in, curiosity breaking through his usual bravado. "What happened out there, Lane? The mission?" She took a deep breath, the memories pressing in like the cold wind from that long-ago storm. "We were 6, sent to intercept a convoy carrying weapons that could have changed the course of the war. We were ambushed, wiped out, except for 3 of us. 2 wounded, 1 unconscious. I carried them all, for miles, through ice and fire, and death." The room seemed to shrink, the noise dimming until all that remained was Harper's voice and the raw truth it bore. "I lost 26 of my team that night," she continued, eyes distant. "Each one a ghost that walks beside. The scars are just reminders. Not of pain, but of survival." Mason swallowed, the enormity of her confession settling heavy in his chest. "And that's why you came back? To teach," Harper nodded. "To make sure no one else gets left behind." In the days that followed, the recruits' attitude toward Harper shifted from wary curiosity to genuine admiration. She became a fixture in their lives, not because she sought attention, but because her actions spoke louder than words ever could. Training sessions grew tougher, expectations higher, but Harper led by example. Every push-up, every sprint, every moment of exhaustion carried the weight of someone who had walked through hell and returned, not unbroken, but unbowed. The final test was approaching, a full-scale simulated combat operation designed to push every cadet to their limits. Harper was assigned as the lead instructor, the one who would oversee strategy, execution, and most importantly, survival. On the day of the test, the sun rose pale and cold. Recruits stood ready, nerves taut as the she. First whistle blew. Harper moved through the ranks, checking gear, offering terse encouragement. Mason watched her, no longer as a rival, but as a mentor, absorbing every command. Every glance dot as the simulation unfolded. Chaos erupted. Smoke grenades, simulated gunfire, sudden ambushes. Harper's voice cut through the noise, steady and commanding. Fall back, cover left flank, evacuate the wounded. She moved like a shadow, directing, adjusting, leading. When Mason found himself pinned behind a barricade, Harper was there, pulling him to safety. Keep moving, she urged, eyes sharp. We're almost clear. When the dust settled and the simulation ended, exhaustion weighed on every soldier's shoulders. But in that moment, Harper stood tall, not a hero seeking glory, but a leader earning respect through sheer will and sacrifice. Later that evening, as the base settled into uneasy quiet, Harper found herself alone on the training field. The stars overhead were cold and distant, yet somehow familiar, like silent witnesses to the burden she carried. Her thoughts drifted back to those lost nights, to the faces of her fallen comrades. She reached into her pocket, fingers closing around the worn photograph she kept hidden. The image was faded, edges curled, but each face was etched in memory with painful clarity. A soft sound approached. Footsteps, hesitant but determined. Mason stepped into the moonlight, his expression sincere. You don't have to carry it alone, he said quietly. Harper looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. Sometimes, she replied, the weight of the past is the only thing that keeps you moving forward. They stood together in the silence, two soldiers bound by shared understanding, scars unseen, stories untold. The next morning, the recruits gathered one last time before deployment. The air was thick with anticipation and unspoken promises. Colonel Ward stepped forward, his voice carrying authority and respect. Sergeant Harper Lane, he announced, has earned more than your attention. She's earned your trust, your respect, and your commitment to the mission ahead. Follow her lead. The formation shifted, recruits standing taller, eyes brighter. Mason caught Harper's gaze, and not a dot, she returned it with steady resolve, because true strength didn't come from medals or applause. It came from the scars carried in silence, from the courage to return again and again so others could stand a chance.